Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences patented technology protects any application against any attack with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Signal Sciences. By connecting to your code repository, Accurix generates a topology across your full stack to reveal risks so that you can harden your architecture. It also scans code for violations against compliance and security standards to enforce best practices. In addition, Accurix develops threat models using vulnerability feeds, IAM privileges, and other data to predict potential breach paths. Learn how easy it is to get started with Accurix at securityweekly.com/Accurix. Discover a simple way to secure your app without the need for a full security team. With trusted software, simply drag and drop your app and let the ML-enabled smart security work. Get it back fully protected within a couple of minutes. With 50 years of security expertise, Erdetto protects over 5 billion devices and applications for some of the world's best-known brands. Change the world one app at a time. To download the white paper on how to address endpoint security in mobile apps, visit securityweekly.com/Erdetto. As the world of software-driven everything becomes a reality and development cycles speed up, sales teams are taking a new approach to application security, one that enables security teams to scale by empowering developers to integrate security into their development workflows and toolsets, all while giving security teams the visibility and control they need. Snyk helps software-driven businesses develop fast and stay secure with a developer-first solution that seamlessly and proactively finds and fixes vulnerabilities in open-source libraries and containers. Learn more and see the solution for yourself at securityweekly.com/Snyk.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by Matt Alderman and John Kinsella. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly and we'll reach out to you once reviewed. Learn how to keep your internet self safe in our next webcast on August 13th. Register for our upcoming webcasts or virtual trainings by visiting securityweekly.com/webcasts or visit securityweekly.com/on-demand to view our previously recorded webcasts. And that brings us to the news. So last week, John and Matt, I tried to get you excited about the Twitter hack. So instead, I was looking for I went through the alphabet of breaches, and I didn't have to go far because I merely went from Twitter to Twilio about a misconfiguration in an S3 bucket that led to a attacker modifying a JavaScript SDK loaded by a bunch of different applications using that Twilio SDK. And so that was pretty interesting in the sense of it's, once again, misconfiguration, supply chain management issues coming up. And I was trying to identify like how malicious this was, or how much mischief was caused in this misconfiguration. It looked like there was some MageCart related links being dropped in there, or content. So that's yet another thing that has come up quite a bit over the last year or so that we've been talking about web app security.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about misconfigurations a lot, right? So a misconfigured S3 bucket gives them access, but this is to me, the more concerning part of this is the supply chain impacts of this, where somebody obviously inserted a malicious SDK library into the release that now allowed them to have some additional access or capabilities that wasn't supposed to be there, right? And we've talked about this concern for a while now, is with all the open source libraries that are out there and the way we build applications with includes, it's really hard to understand what your application is actually bringing in when it runs. And here's a perfect example of a supply chain vulnerability attack that brought a piece of malicious software in. Now, in this case, Twilio actually found it pretty early. I think they found it within like an hour and 10 minutes or something like that. So they had great monitoring in place. But again, it's still a pretty interesting attack and a big concern with open source software.
No, absolutely, and a smart type of attack vector too, because you don't have to compromise perhaps the destination website you're going after. You compromise, as you said, their supply chain, who they're depending on, or pop the CDN, modify the data from there. So once again, pretty good, pretty interesting, and just some do the basics, as we were just talking with John Matherly from Shodan. AWS, those S3 misconfigurations, that's a basic, and it's still a problem. Speaking of also still problems, I have to sneak this in because John found this right at the end of last week's episode, and it's a directory traversal, which is why. But what's interesting here is that it's in Cisco, basically a Cisco devices. What do they call their adaptive appliance software and firepower threat defense? So, lots of cool words in the title, but basically a web management front end that interestingly has a language parameter, a lang parameter. And what essentially looks like it's being done is that on the back end, in order to support like localization, you could have EN or FR for French and so on. And the application possibly was using that lang parameter to traverse where to serve the front end content, the language specific content for the end user. And if you drop a .. slash in there, you could poke around on the device. And as always with the path traversals, it brings up the ideas of why aren't you doing why are you composing paths via user supply data in the first place? And another thing, why aren't you isolating your resources to prevent this type of directory traversal as well? So there's a lot of things that how containerization might work, or different types of isolation can help by default minimize these types of impacts.
But you know why? It's because of tech debt. They built this sucker, 15, 20 years ago. That's the way you did it back then. All these vulnerabilities emerge. Now you have to think about rechanging and fixing some of that, and it gets put on the side burner because it's tech debt.
Yeah, I can't remember. It's Cisco ASA, so I don't know. Who wants to play the game of which acquisition did this come from? It wasn't the Pix code base. It's one of the IDSs they pulled in, probably. Says firepower, so wasn't that part of that? Was another acquisition. I mean, the title of this thing is probably that's a buffer overflow in and of itself. This isn't the one I found last week, Mike. This is another one. This one makes me giggle even harder. I mean, you're doing a path traversal on a security device on a what? Come on. But yeah, there's great learning here on this. And again, I'm still feeling guilty about the Twitter thing from last week. The Twitter thing was super. It was valuable and interesting. Why it wasn't interesting to me, I think, and I've been trying to put this in words just for the last week, is I know Twitter has a solid security program, solid security team, and I think just in my mind that one is why I sound not interested is at the end of it, it's going to happen to all of us, right? We're all going to get hacked somehow. And that's the event itself wasn't the problem, but on this one, when you look at code, either if someone looks at my code or if I look at someone else's code, you're going to start seeing a bunch of patterns repeated. And sometimes we want to try and boil those down and have it into a function. But one pattern which should be repeated is checking input every single time we get it, right? It's not, oh, don't worry, that's just a language variable. Don't have to worry about that one. Every single thing you have to check. And I think this is a really good example of that.
So, John, 2005 is when Cisco ASA was announced. It inherited many of the Pix features. So it was kind of a combination of products, but it's been 15 years.
Oh, boy.
Yes, the archaeology of security vulnerabilities. This is the entertaining part that gets, at least for me, that gets interesting. But for all of our listeners, perhaps we'll move on to and keep things interesting. Also on a theme of tech debt and related to also a little bit of what we were talking about with John from Shodan, as opposed to John the Crazy. This episode is another vulnerability that was apparently affecting 7 years of LG Android devices. So I pulled out this article for a couple of reasons. One, Matt, you already glommed onto that idea, or there's a theme here about tech debt and just old devices. And this points to the idea that you can have a very good Android securable operating system, but if your ecosystem isn't equally secure, then your end user, the consumer space, is still going to have challenges. As well as, this is a nice write-up, the nice kind of write-up that we like to see. So it's educational. It talks a little bit about the insides of Qualcomm devices, and it starts off with the research who wrote this up, talking about a couple different challenges or a way of trying to report and get such a bug fixed. So kind of a recurring theme from the segment we just had with the other John.
What's interesting about this one, this does not come from a security researcher. He basically comes out and says, hey, I'm not a security professional by any means, but then walks you through kind of the whole bootloader process on the LG phones and where the vulnerabilities were. This goes back to my conversation. One of the advantages I think Apple has is they control the hardware ecosystem as well. And so when you have Android in the mix and you have a lot of different hardware providers from an ecosystem, I think it's a lot harder to secure that environment. No matter what Android does at the OS level, you still have dependencies on the hardware layer that Android doesn't really control well. And so it creates these types of attacks. And I'm not saying Apple's perfect, but they control more of the pieces that makes it a little easier for them to solve both the OS and the hardware side of this issue.
Yeah, and I think that's where that's managing the life cycle of devices, and you also just pointing to the patch management. Can you patch a device in your user population? How easy is it for everyone to get the most recent updates? And I'm going to use that to talk about, we have one more interesting security flaws, security vulnerabilities to talk about. But I'm going to segue for a second here to switch from the opposite end of tech debt into what browsers are doing to protect us now and in the future. So there's a lot of good web security standards that have continued to be developed. And I linked here an article from Google Security talking about Chrome and Firefox, and to a degree Safari, although the support for some of these security developments or security standards isn't quite universal among all three of them. But what stands out to me is that they're going after trying to defeat some vulnerability classes. So they introduced this concept called trusted types, which is intentionally designed to pretty much kill off DOM-based XSS, so one particular flavor of cross-site scripting. And it's basically going through the idea of, here's a secure default, no longer allow developers to create new HTML nodes from strings, at least force them to go through a pattern that says, here is how you create a new node, and now plug that node into the DOM, go forth and conquer. And I think that is going to be maybe a little bit of heavy lifting, or hopefully just medium lifting for front-end developers. But ultimately, it's a great way of seeing secure defaults come. And there's actually a couple more features that they're called out in this article. But I'm not sure if Matt or John, you had a chance to look through these to see if there's anyone in particular that stood out for you.
The trusted DOM. Well, I'll go first. The trusted DOM one. It caught my attention after I've spent the last few weeks in TypeScript. So at first that made, the thought was, is this their version of Microsoft TypeScript? I don't think it is.
No.
It's interesting. And then the second part of what sort of caught my eye when I read this is, when I squeeze the web developer hat on the head, and you get something done, and then you go start testing and playing with it. You have to start thinking about cores and all these different types of things. And usually, whatever the default is, this time I'm using Vue.js with TypeScript. And when you start looking at what's going on in there and actually trying to make it work, it's like a lot of these things you have to bring in. So I'm looking at this from a developer point of view of like, okay, what do I have to add to my application now to make this stuff work? And that I think still comes back to it's we preach a lot about like to secure defaults and all this type of thing. But it's a pain in the butt for a developer to figure out. And it's like, yeah, I'll do the half hour, an hour research and figure out what I need to put in and do this, but it's yet another thing. And I think maybe hopefully Vue and React and all these guys will do some secure defaults for us, but it's yet another thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. And go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to say on that same point, right? The question here is great capabilities and features in the browser, but what's the development lift to make this stuff work, right? And we were talking about tech debt. This becomes a tech debt discussion in some respects, right? How do I now update my web interface to allow some of this stuff to happen? What's that lift like on these applications to get the benefit out of some of this?
Yeah, I think there's one example that they have. They're talking about the CSP script nonces, and those actually script nonces have been actually around for a while. And content security policy, there was level 1, then level 2, then level 3, which sounds like a great D&D character to me. So no objections there. But it was also extremely complicated. It was, I'm going to say, almost impossible to retrofit on an existing application. You kind of had to build your application from scratch to be CSP friendly. And what they highlighted here is they introduced this concept of a strict dynamic, which is actually addressing a very common challenge that front-end developers run into, where they say, well, we're using this third-party JavaScript that might be just a shim that's loading then something else. For example, a Twilio SDK or something like that. They may just have a 1 or 2 line JavaScript that says, put this into your website, and then this script loads the latest version of the JavaScript. With a nonce, you would actually have to have a way to manage the absolute latest nonce for the absolute latest script, as well as figure out, have all the CDNs been updated? What's this cascading effect to actually make this script that we know we trust run? So strict dynamic actually acknowledges that as making, I think, front-end life developer. So a lot of this is going to be a lift. But I think there is at least some indications that they're acknowledging that developers are going to have to do some work and acknowledging the challenges that developers ran into with prior iterations of things like content security policy. So overall, I'm going to call it a net win, at least for now. And the other thing I had to point out too is there's the they're improving cores as well and adding some new headers, the sec fetch headers. So this one I just had to mention there for you, John, because yes, the web standards are finally making fetch happen. So this is a good thing. With that, we can possibly then switch back to another interesting article to me that was some more in-depth research around Alexa and Alexa skills. And this is, I will also point to a generalized problem to any type of marketplace. So the two obvious ones are the Google Play and iOS App Store. But Slack has their equivalent of an app marketplace. Same with Atlassian. Same with Salesforce, for example. So this fundamental problem isn't unique to Amazon. But to talk about Amazon in particular, some academic researchers found some ways to basically inject what are called skills for your Alexa, to inject some undesired skills or some potentially malicious skills into others that look innocuous, and basically bypass what the approval process looks like and get those into the be able to deploy it on Alexa. And these would be things like collecting information from kids, which should be prevented, or accessing features that should have been exposed in the description of what the skill does, things like that. So I'll pause there and give you guys a chance to talk. I'm going on way too long here.
No, you're fine. It's what it's reminded me of back when I was doing the CloudStack thing, we had some folks at one point, they were thinking about, could we add a marketplace for CloudStack so that same thing, you could bring skills into that product or project. And there were some folks back then who were worried about, that could be sort of sketchy, right? If you've got something like that where people could bring in a skill, to use that phrase, into something being used in an enterprise. And I'm like, no, that'll never happen, blah, blah, blah. And hey, here you go. So it's interesting that the last sentence on the headline really sort of, or on the tagline really sort of gives me the shivers, all targeted at children. But it's and again, what's also interesting about this, like, so it's one of the things in my mind recently is back to puzzle pieces. How can you quickly, you're just talking about all these different orgs that want to have some sort of a storefront or a marketplace or, a widget gallery, pick your phrase. Every single one has to go and builds their own, that particular wheel. Now you've got all these ones that have different either requirements for the people who want to work in them, but then also they all have their own versions of potential bugs because they've all built that wheel themselves. So it's lots to think about besides just the actual issue itself.
It is. And the researchers here, they set up a really nice website on a github.io website with a lot of their research, a lot of the documentation. And to your point, too, they mentioned some good things that stood out to me that could be applicable for additional threat modeling in, somewhat similar scenarios. And just to go through some of the recommendations that they made or reasons why they feel that they were successful, there was real quick an inconsistency in checking, an overtrust placed on developers, meaning third-party developers for these types of things. Also, humans were involved in the certification, and humans can be inconsistent, for example, in their checking. And there's also negligence, just missed things during certification. So these are some good points, I think, that, if you have your product security hat on, look at this, what can you learn, and then apply to your own organization, as well as how people are involved in this evaluation process. And that's where I also want to call out that idea of ceremonies, meaning people are part of your workflow. People are part of your protocol for approvals, and what their responsibilities are and how they're supposed to execute them should actually be very important, because then you lose trustworthiness or you get issues like this that can come up with the Alexa skills.
Yeah, we've seen the same problem with WordPress plugins. Any type of ecosystem like this will instinctively find a way to get some of this malicious stuff in. People are going to try to sneak it in. And so we've seen it in a lot of places. Some do a better job than others, but we're always going to see this stuff. I think it's a combination of some really good testing tooling with some really consistent human review process to really try to minimize this. But, we've seen a lot of these malicious type of activities before.
Matt, that's a really great analogy, because I don't know if you heard my giggle at the mention of WordPress plugins. I mean, that space is absolutely horrible, and there's so much crap in there. But why? Because the plugins are so simple to write and so simple to just go ahead and throw up there and never ever think about having to maintain your code base again. And I'm guessing that's a little bit of what the Alexa marketplace is like. I have no Alexa devices. I don't want them. I try to avoid that space. But I imagine, since they are sort of the antithesis of Apple here, where they want everyone to be able to write something and bring it in, you're giving yourself a place where, how do you manage that circus? So that's an interesting way to look at this, I think.
It is, and it's scary, and that's where I'm going to sneak in my horror movie reference, and this is clearly the skills have eyes is my movie reference for the day. Also, speaking of the big vendors that start with A, Apple, I think last year at WWDC, talked about how they were going to create a device that will be more researcher-friendly, so that researchers could more easily access things like command line on iPhones and iOS. And now they have released more details around the program and what the program actually would look like and what the devices can do. And there's definitely been some, I'll say, either lukewarm or possibly even polarizing reactions to this that a little bit speaks to the theme that with John we were talking about in the earlier segment about working with vendors and communicating with vendors, and how do you build that relationship with them. And in this case, a lot of the complaints are that here is Apple creating a researcher-friendly device, but how much are they creating and providing this device and putting, T's and C's around it so that they ensure they're the ones and only ones who get the information that comes, the research information out of this on their terms, versus the larger research community, for example, linked to a ZDNet article talking about Google's Project Zero stance on this, saying that it doesn't appeal to them because they want to basically research and report and disclose any type of vulns on their own terms. So it kind of interesting from that part of that ongoing discussion that's been going for at least 10, if not 20 years or longer.
Yeah, it's interesting the terms of the vulnerability disclosure components of this, right? And I think that's what Google's Project Zero really has an issue with. And And if you're not using SRD, then you have more control over it, but they recommend you report to Apple's bug bounty program. So then, again, some of these potential restrictions come into play. It's just I think it's, look, on the one side, I think this is a really great thing from Apple to do, to say, look, here's something we're going to give you access to find more vulnerabilities, but they're going to control how those vulnerabilities get reported, patched, etc. That's kind of the downside, I think, from the bug bounty kind of hacker side of the community. But at the end of the day, if done right, this should improve the overall security of the iOS platform, which I think is a positive. I just don't think a lot of people like the terms that Apple's putting on them.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about this, and I'm trying to, generally I think I'm negative on this, but if, to take a step back and look at what they've done, Apple's put a lot of work into this, right? This isn't something that they just threw over the fence and said, here, test suckers. They've probably had, I'm guessing, at least several developers working on this to make this available and make this possible. But the reason they're doing that is because they want to control the messaging and the experience, well, not the hacker experience. They want to control how that stuff comes out, and that's what I have a bit of a problem with. So I don't know. It's interesting. Neat to see they're doing it. Space for improvement. How about that?
Well, it allows them to control the PR message, if nothing else.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it does point to at least the one aspect when there's a vulnerability that gets in the news because it's CVSS 10 and affects 1 billion devices. One in this case could actually point to, in fact, there probably are 1 billion or so iPhones out there, as opposed to having to pop onto Shodan and just doing a scan for all the IoT cameras out there that are either an IoT camera or just somebody running their own honeypot to try and see what people are scanning for.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure there's folks at Apple that very sincerely, that's why they're doing this. It's like, look, if there's something out there, we want to protect our user base. We want to actually give us a chance to, standard disclosure process, right? Take it, acknowledge it, research it, figure out, come up with a patch, all those type of things. And if that's the way it was, I'd be totally fine with it. But putting the guardrails up around it, and then I'm almost positive I've seen cases where they're not responding to people all the time. And that's the part that really irks me. So that's where there's space for improvement.
Yeah, it's quite understandable, because I think the other thing that that I'll mention here too is that where are the incentives? That's one of the things we've been talking about recently. Where are the incentives for disclosing vulnerabilities? So obviously Apple wants to create a more bespoke experience for researchers to be able to have their tooling, basically worry less about the tooling and just focus on, here's how to fuzz, here's how to research, here's how to poke around at the internals of the device, but also say, these results come back to Apple and don't go to a vulnerability broker or something like that. So there are interesting economics, I would imagine, around there. That doesn't necessarily excuse this to go one way or the other, but I bring that up in order to make the conversation much richer, so we understand where are people coming from and what are we actually trying to optimize for in this type of situation. And I think there is, speaking of optimizing, we're going to switch back to pretty much a familiar topic. So there's an article here from CSO Online about, what is DevSecOps. So perhaps not too surprising what it's talking about here in terms of topics. But one thing that stood out to me is this article actually has quite a bit of emphasis on testing, and specifically security testing, which I think kind of ties together a lot of the vulns we've been talking about already. From the Apple SRD all the way to the original supply chain, and how can you trust, the JavaScript SDKs that you're loading. And even John, you've mentioned, many months ago about, security testing, or even security testing as a service, or security test-driven development, the unfortunate acronym. But I think this was a good article just to kind of help tie all of these things together.
Yeah, here's what I love about this article is everything is the responsibility of the development team. And I think security has to understand its place in this concept of DevSecOps. It's job is to make sure that the tools and the processes are influencing the developers to fix the stuff. This is not a separate team. This is not a separate group that sits over in the corner by itself and says, look, here's all the vulnerabilities and throw them back over the fence and expect development team to get it all done. Chris Weisselpohl from Vericode's actually on next week in a micro interview as part of Virtual Hacker Summer Camp. I don't know what we're going to talk about yet, but he's quoted in this article, and I think he's right. Look, the biggest challenge here is not just the testing side of it, but it's the fixing of this is owned by the development teams. And that means all of this information, all this data has to be integrated back into the development side of the house to make it easy to fix this stuff. And I think that's still the big gap from a security to DevOps perspective that we just haven't fully solved yet.
Yeah, I think that makes a great point too when we're talking about the new web standards that browsers are supporting. Is this just are these standards a really easy thing because they make the security team happy because now we can prevent DOM-based XSS, we can make CSRF a lot harder, we can prevent a lot of information leaks from the same origin, but that's the DevOps side. And how can the developers actually come in and be able to actually apply and do the work that needs to be done, not even just fixing things like you were saying, but deploy what these new security features are. So yeah, great point that's where the responsibility is. So on DevOps, so let's support DevOps and focus on optimizing for them.
Yeah. And I think that's the big gap still in the industry is we see security as a separate thing outside of the development team. And in order for this to work, it has to be fully integrated in with the development teams. We have to make this really easy for the developers to understand how to fix and get those patches back out. Otherwise, we're never going to get to this concept of DevSecOps.
Yeah. So Matt, I want to say, when I think of summer camps, immediately I prefer to think of like Camp Redwood or Camp Crystal Lake. But want to give us a quick preview of the virtual hacker summer camp that we'll have next week?
Yeah, so next week we're going to run 4 days of micro interviews and 4 of our main shows. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we'll be live streaming just like we do for the shows. But on the first part of the day, it's going to be micro interviews. There's going to be a combination of sponsored interviews, analysts, researchers, all coming on to talk about some of the things that they're working on. In the evenings, then we're going to live stream Application Security Weekly on Monday, Business Security Weekly on Tuesday, Enterprise Security Weekly on Wednesday, and of course, Paul's Security Weekly on Thursday night. So 4 days of jam-packed just sessions, information, all going to be live streamed. We'll be working the Discord server side as well. So I hope everybody can join us.
Yeah, absolutely. Please join us. And there'll be a lot of micro interviews and a lot of the different, all the weekly shows, security weekly shows will be going on. So check them all out. Come say hi in the Discord. And with that, I want to say thank you, Matt. Thank you, John. And thanks everyone for joining us. We'll see you again next week on Virtual Summer Camp with Application Security Weekly.